23 blood samples, 1 consent form, 0 permission to rewrite a people's origin. The Havasupai people live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, accessible only by an 8-mile trail. In 1989, they opened their arms to a researcher and trusted her with something they could never get back. What happened next forced science to confront everything it claims to stand for. And it forced one geneticist, Malhi, to ask a question that changed his entire field. You have probably heard of the Bering Land Bridge, the frozen corridor connecting Asia and North America. It is the textbook answer to one of history's oldest questions. Where did the first Americans come from? For decades, the scientific consensus said it clearly. People walked across from Siberia, roughly 13,000 to 16,000 years ago. The map was clean. The theory was settled. The story seemed complete. But science has a habit of finding what it goes looking for and ignoring what it didn't expect. And for the Havasupai people, whose name means people of the blue-green water, the origin story was never in question. Their oral history places their beginning inside the Grand Canyon itself, not as arrivals from somewhere else, but as people who emerged from this specific landscape. This was not mythology to them. It was identity. It was law. It was home. So when a university researcher arrived in 1989, offering help with a diabetes epidemic that had been climbing for years, the Havasupai community listened. Her name was Therese Markow. She was a researcher at Arizona State University. The consent forms she brought were specific. Blood samples would be used for diabetes research. The disease had taken hold with a force that the community could not outpace on its own. The tribe had approximately 650 enrolled members. The need was real and urgent. So they rolled up their sleeves in Supai, Arizona, at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and they gave. They gave because they believed it would help their children. The canyon held the sound of that trust. What the Havasupai people did not know was that those vials would travel far beyond any diabetes study. Over the next decade, those blood samples appeared in at least 23 published academic papers entirely separate from the 23 samples originally collected. Those papers covered schizophrenia, inbreeding, and population migration, the very question of where the Havasupai people originally came from. Not one of those studies had the tribe's consent. Not one researcher came back to Supai to explain what they were doing. Not one paper acknowledged that the people who gave those samples had a living, spoken, sacred relationship to the answer being studied. The blood was taken for one purpose and used for another. And somewhere in those labs, the Havasupai people's own DNA was being used to argue that their ancestors had walked in from somewhere else. Imagine donating your medical records to find a cure for a disease in your family, and then a stranger uses them to rewrite your entire family history without asking, without telling, without stopping. That is exactly what happened, and it is exactly why genetics and consent cannot be separated. Malhi was in his early years as a geneticist when the Havasupai case began moving through the courts. He was of Punjabi descent, trained in the precise, quantitative language of DNA science. His early work, beginning around 2004, focused on mitochondrial DNA in indigenous North American populations. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through mothers, a thread connecting you to your maternal line across thousands of generations. Malhi was trying to read that thread, to understand the deep past encoded in living people's cells. This is intricate science, but it requires something the field had rarely stopped to ask for. It requires access to people's bodies. And access to bodies, especially indigenous bodies, has a history in this country that does not wash clean. That history was about to become impossible to ignore. The Havasupai tribe filed suit against the Arizona Board of Regents. They wanted their blood returned. They wanted acknowledgement of what had been done. They wanted it to mean something. Tribal member Carletta Talusi became one of the public faces of that fight. She had a clarity about the harm that no legal brief could fully capture. She told a reporter, in words that have been repeated in classrooms and journals ever since, "They used our blood to take away our identity." 7 words that hold everything: the betrayal, the precision of the wound, the specific cruelty of using someone's own body against their sense of self. In 2010, Maricopa County Superior Court reached a settlement. Arizona State University agreed to pay $700,000 to the Havasupai tribe. For a tribe of approximately 650 enrolled members, that amounts to roughly $1,076 per person. $1,076 in exchange for violations that reached into their sacred history. But the money was not the point, and the Havasupai knew it. The settlement also required ASU to physically return the blood samples to the tribe. The vials came back to Supai, the community held them, and then they buried them. Returned to the earth. The settlement also included support for a school and a health clinic, the things the community had needed all along. But the larger question, the one that haunted the entire case, was not answered by the settlement. The question was, how does this never happen again? In labs across the country, ancient remains and living donors were still being studied under consent frameworks built for medical trials, not for communities with oral histories and sovereignty. The field had no standard. It had no protocol. It had no mechanism for asking what a community actually wanted to know. Ripan Malhi was paying attention to all of this. He was having conversations that most scientists in his position never had, with indigenous scholars, with community members, with people who explained, in precise terms, what was at stake. They explained that DNA research was not a neutral act when applied to people whose identity, land rights, and sovereignty were rooted in their origin stories. They explained that a scientist asking, "Where did you come from?" was not always a scientific question. Sometimes it was a legal challenge. Sometimes it was a political weapon. Sometimes it was both. Malhi was listening, and what he heard changed how he worked. He began to understand that the science does not start with a sample. It starts with a conversation. And that conversation had to happen before any DNA was extracted, before any paper was written, before any theory was formed. This sounds simple. In the culture of academic genetics, in 2010, it was genuinely radical. Most scientists were trained to see access to DNA as the starting line. Malhi was beginning to see it as the finish line, the thing you earn. If the community decides you have. The model he was building was not just more ethical. He was becoming convinced it was also better science. Because if a community controls what questions get asked, they can also tell you what questions are worth asking. And indigenous communities had been sitting on knowledge about their own histories that no lab had ever thought to request. In 2011, Ripan Malhi co-founded a program called SING. The full name is the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics. The premise was straightforward, and the implications were enormous. Instead of non-indigenous scientists going into indigenous communities to extract data, SING trained indigenous people to become the scientists themselves. They learned genomics, they learned laboratory technique, and they learned ethics, not as an afterthought, but as the foundation. The ethics training was not a compliance checkbox. It was woven into every day of the curriculum. By approximately 2022, SING had trained over 200 indigenous students and researchers. 200 people, enough to staff the science department of a mid-sized university, now working inside their own communities, rather than having outsiders work on them. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A researcher from outside a community asks, "What does this DNA tell me about these people?" A researcher from inside a community asks, "What does this DNA tell us about ourselves?" And do we even want that question answered? Those are fundamentally different scientific projects. Meanwhile, in museums and universities across the United States, another reckoning was underway. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, had been passed in 1990. It required institutions holding Native American ancestral remains to inventory and return them to the appropriate nations. 34 years later, the numbers tell a specific story. Approximately 90,000 Native American ancestral remains had been held in U.S. museum and university collections. 90,000 people, enough to fill Madison Square Garden more than 4 times over, held in storage rather than returned to their nations. As of 2024, approximately 10,300 had been returned. That is roughly 11%. After 34 years, 89% still waiting The remains were not returned only because institutions were slow and underfunded and bureaucratic. They also were not returned because some researchers had not finished using them. Ancient DNA extraction from skeletal remains was advancing rapidly through the 2010s. Labs at Harvard and Copenhagen were producing ancient America's DNA data at a pace that had never been possible before. These were remarkable scientific achievements. The findings were genuinely illuminating, and they were generating serious, documented criticism from indigenous scholars and communities who had not been consulted. The critique was not anti-science. It was pro-consent, and it was precisely the kind of critique that Malhi's framework was designed to address. Because here is what was becoming clear. You cannot separate the question of who controls the research from the question of what the research reveals. Those two things are not in tension. They are connected. So here is where the story stands in 2011. A settlement has been reached. Blood samples have been buried. A program has been founded. The question is no longer whether consent matters. The Havasupai made that answer permanent. The question now is whether a new model can actually produce the science it promises and what that science might reveal. Because the DNA findings coming out of this era are not tidying up the origin story. They are complicating it in ways nobody predicted. The textbook version of how people first came to the Americas fits on a single map. A land bridge, one crossing, one direction, one moment in time. It is a clean story. It is also increasingly a story the evidence does not fully support. In 2018, a set of ancient DNA studies published in the journal Nature identified something that had no easy explanation. Researchers examining DNA from indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin found a genetic signal they called Population Y. Population Y showed an unexpected genetic relationship, not to Siberian populations, as the Bering Land Bridge model would predict, but to populations in Australasia. Australasia, meaning the region of Australia, Papua New Guinea, and nearby islands, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. This is not a fringe finding. It was published in Nature. It was peer-reviewed. It has been replicated in subsequent studies. And it has no clean explanation within the single-crossing Bering Land Bridge model. Scientists do not yet know what it means. They are still working on it. But they know what it means for the old story. It means the old story is incomplete. Now consider what Malhi's consent-based model brings to this moment. If the origin story is more complex than one crossing, if there were multiple migrations, multiple routes, multiple populations, then indigenous oral histories that describe emergence from specific landscapes deserve a different kind of attention. Not dismissal, not the label of legend. Serious, careful, science-adjacent attention. Because oral histories have preserved knowledge about environments, animals, weather patterns, and relationships to land that written records do not contain. They are not mythology competing with data. They are data of a different kind. This is not a sentimental argument. It is an argument about how knowledge works. And scientists trained inside indigenous communities, the researchers Singh is producing, are positioned to hear it in ways that outside researchers are not. In one study of lake sediment in the Pacific Northwest, pollen layers from plants that no longer grow there were found preserved at the bottom. The oral histories of the people who had lived alongside that lake remembered those plants. The data confirmed the memory. This is what happens when you do not separate the science from the people who hold the knowledge. Now picture Ripon Malhi at a table, not a lab bench, but a table, across from tribal elders. He is not presenting results. He is asking questions before any results exist. What do you want to know? What should stay yours? What questions are off the table, entirely and permanently? These are not questions that slow science down. They are questions that point science in the direction of something true. In 2015, Malhi and colleagues published research in PLOS One on ancient DNA from indigenous North American populations. The consent frameworks used in that study had been co-developed with the tribal communities involved. It was not the first time indigenous DNA had been studied. It was one of the first times it had been studied this way. The research happened because the communities decided it could. not because a researcher decided it should. That difference is the entire moral architecture of what Malhi was building. In 2017, another case brought these questions into sharp focus. The Ancient One, also known as Kennewick Man, was an 8,500-year-old set of remains found along the Columbia River in Washington state in 1996. For 2 decades, scientists and tribes fought over who had the right to study those bones and who had the right to bury them. After NAGPRA repatriation was completed in February 2017, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation partnered with geneticists in a consent-governed study. The results confirmed genetic affinity with contemporary indigenous peoples of the Americas. The Ancient One was home. His descendants had been right. The science confirmed what the oral history already held. And then, in 2021, the ground itself spoke. White Sands National Park sits in the Tularosa Basin of southern New Mexico. The gypsum dunes there are blinding white. They absorb heat differently than sand, cooler underfoot in the early morning, warm and powdery by midday. In September 2021, a paper published in the journal Science reported something found beneath those dunes. Footprints. Human footprints, pressed into ancient lake sediment, preserved for a span of time that no textbook had prepared anyone to consider. The dating was done carefully, using radiocarbon analysis of seeds found in the layers directly above and below the prints. The age of those footprints, approximately 23,000 years. If all of recorded human history writing, cities, agriculture, everything, were compressed into 1 hour, those footprints were made roughly 11 hours before that clock even started. And they were made in the American Southwest, during the last glacial maximum. This is the critical detail. The last glacial maximum is the period when global ice sheets were at their greatest extent. It is also the period when the passageway between the ice sheets that the Bering Land Bridge crossing supposedly used was completely closed, sealed shut by glacial ice, a physical fact the sediment layers record without ambiguity. So the people who made those footprints at White Sands 23,000 years ago could not have crossed through an ice corridor that did not yet exist. They got there some other way. Or, and this is the possibility that changes everything, they had been there far longer than anyone in the mainstream scientific community had accounted for. The textbook map, the clean single crossing story, the settled consensus, none of it explains those footprints. Matthew Bennett and his colleagues at Bournemouth University, who led the White Sand study, were careful and precise in their conclusions. They did not claim to know how those people got there. They reported what the sediment layers showed. But the implications radiated outward from that New Mexico basin like heat from the white gypsum dunes. If people were in the American Southwest 23,000 years ago, then indigenous peoples of the Americas have been here, rooted here, belonging here, for far longer than the Bering Land Bridge timeline allowed. And suddenly the oral histories of peoples who describe emergence from the land, not migration across it, sit closer to the physical evidence than the academic consensus. The Havasupai people say they belong to the Grand Canyon, that the canyon is their origin point. Science once used their own DNA to argue otherwise. Science is now finding footprints that make the argument far less certain. This is not a vindication, exactly. The science is still unresolved. The footprints do not prove the oral history. But they do something equally important. They prove that the oral history was never as easily dismissible as the textbook claimed. Carletta Talusi said, "They used our blood to take away our identity." What the White Sands footprints suggest is that the identity was never theirs to take. Meanwhile, genetics itself is producing findings that push in the same direction. Population Y, identified in those 2018 Nature studies, still has no clean explanation. Ancient DNA studies published in Cell and affiliated journals through 2023 continue to refine the models of how and when the Americas were peopled. Each new study adds complexity. Each new study asks more questions than it answers. And increasingly, the leading journals are requiring researchers to document tribal consultation as part of peer review. The consent framework that Malhi helped build is now cited as a field standard. This happened not because the journals became sentimental. It happened because the science demanded it. You cannot study populations without the cooperation of those populations. And cooperation requires trust, and trust requires consent, and consent requires the kind of relationship that begins with a conversation, not a consent form slid across a table. In 2022, geneticist and anthropologist Jennifer Raff published a book called Origin: A Genetic History of the Americas. Raff synthesized the ancient DNA findings from the previous decade, including work that Malhi contributed to. Her argument was explicit. Consent-based research protocols are not separate from scientific validity. They are part of it. A study conducted without adequate consent is not just ethically compromised, it is scientifically compromised. Because communities that distrust researchers will not participate, and data gathered from communities who feel surveilled rather than partnered will be incomplete. The Havasupai case did not just produce a lawsuit. It produced a generation of researchers who understood, from a concrete, real-world example, what happens when you take the ethics out of the science. You get 23 papers, and a community that will never fully trust a research institution again. And you get a field that has to rebuild that trust from the beginning, one conversation at a time. Now consider what is quietly sitting alongside all of this in the Great Lakes region of North America. The Old Copper Complex, a culture centered in what is now Wisconsin and surrounding states, produced copper tools and ceremonial objects dating to approximately 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago, the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region were among the earliest known metalworkers anywhere in the world. Not primitive, not prehistorical, not waiting to be discovered. Creating, innovating, building a material culture of remarkable sophistication. 7,000 years before Columbus. 7,000 years before any European had a name for this continent. These people were here. Their descendants are here. And their genetic history, the record encoded in their cells, belongs to them. It has always belonged to them. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because the fight over who controls that record is not over. In 2024, ancient DNA research is accelerating at a pace that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. Sequencing technology has become faster, cheaper, and more sensitive. Researchers can now extract usable DNA from remains that were once considered too degraded to analyze. This is remarkable science. It is also a live crisis for indigenous nations navigating what it means. At least 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States are currently navigating questions about their genetic data. Who can study it? Under what conditions? For what purposes? With what oversight? These are not abstract policy questions. They are immediate and consequential. A DNA study published without consent can be used in land rights disputes. It can be used in enrollment decisions. It can be used to challenge federal recognition. The stakes of who controls indigenous DNA are not academic. They are territorial. They are legal. They are existential. This is why the model Malhi helped build matters beyond the walls of any single laboratory. Singh now has over 200 trained indigenous genomics researchers as of approximately 2022. Those researchers are not just producing papers. They are sitting on tribal councils. They are advising on research agreements. They are reading the consent forms before they are signed. They are, in a very specific sense, the answer to what happened in 1989. They are what it looks like when a community decides it will understand the science well enough to protect itself from the science. This is not distrust of knowledge. It is mastery of knowledge, deployed for sovereignty. Meanwhile, the NAGPRA numbers remain what they are. 89% of documented ancestral remains still unreturned, 34 years after the law required their return. Roughly 10,300 returned out of 90,000. The rest still waiting in storage facilities at institutions that received federal funding to hold them. In 2023 and 2024, renewed attention to NAGPRA compliance produced new regulations and new deadlines. Some institutions responded. Many did not. The pattern that produced the Havasupai case, extraction without consent, research without relationship, publication without accountability, did not end with the settlement. It slowed. It became more careful. It became aware of itself. but it did not end. And so the work that Malhi's framework represents is not historical, it is present tense. Every year, proposals land on tribal councils' desks from researchers who want access to community DNA. Every year, those councils have to decide, is this person asking a question we want answered? Are they prepared to sit with us long enough to understand which questions we won't allow? The science is not waiting for the ethics to catch up. The ethics are running alongside, arguing, sometimes winning. And the footprints at White Sands are still there in the gypsum sediment, 23,000 years old, made by people who were standing in the American Southwest while the ice sheets were at their maximum. No single theory explains them cleanly. Not yet. What we know is this: the human story of the Americas is older, more complex, and more various than the textbook ever contained. And the people whose ancestors made those footprints, whose ancestors worked copper into ceremony 7,000 years ago, who survived at the bottom of the Grand Canyon through generations of drought and flood and colonial violence, are still here. They are reading the research. They are writing the research. They are deciding what the research is allowed to ask. That is not a concession science made reluctantly. That is what science looks like when it grows up. Ripen Malhi's journey from mitochondrial DNA papers to co-founding a program that puts genomic power inside indigenous communities is not a story about one scientist having an epiphany. It is a story about a field encountering its own contradictions and being forced, by a lawsuit, by a settlement, by the voices of people like Carletta Talusi, to reckon with them. The reckoning is ongoing. The footprints are 23,000 years old. The field is still young. The communities have been patient longer than any institution deserves. What Malhi and his collaborators built is fragile and imperfect and real. It is a protocol. It is a program. It is a set of conversations that happen before any needle touches any vein. It is the difference between a scientist who arrives with a theory and a scientist who arrives with a question. And it is producing, slowly, carefully, the kind of science that might actually be trusted, not because it tells communities what they want to hear, but because it asks communities what they want to know. The Havasupai people buried their blood samples in the earth of the Grand Canyon. The canyon held them, the way it has held everything belonging to that people for longer than any study has yet measured. The science is still running to catch up to what the land already knows. 23,000 years ago, someone pressed their foot into wet sediment in New Mexico and kept walking. We do not know their name. We do not know their language. We do not know what they called the sky above that ancient lake. But they were here before the theory said they should have been. And the people who hold oral histories of emergence from this land have been saying so, in their own ways, for as long as they have been speaking. Science is beginning to listen, not because it is generous, because the evidence demands it. If you want to understand what ethical science looks like, it looks like a room where the researcher speaks last. It looks like consent forms built by communities, not handed to them. It looks like over 200 indigenous genomics researchers trained to ask their own questions of their own inheritance. It looks like blood returned to the earth. The question of where the first Americans came from is not settled. It may never be fully settled. But the question of who has the right to investigate it, that one is clearer now than it was in 1989. Carletta Talusi's 7 words should be read at the beginning of every genomics course taught in this country. They used our blood to take away our identity. 7 words. A field's entire ethical education, if it is willing to receive it. The Americas were never empty. The histories were never simple. The people were never gone. The footprints are still there. The story is still open. Some origins can only be understood by the people who are still living them. Some origins can only be understood by the people who are still living them. Look up the White Sands footprints and imagine the person who made them, walking 23,000 years ago. Somewhere they clearly belonged. The Americas were never empty. The histories were never simple. The people were never gone. And the most important finding in the genetics of human origins may not be encoded in any cell. It may be this: you cannot understand where people came from until you are willing to ask them, and then willing to listen. The footprints are still there. The story is still open. Some origins can only be understood by the people who are still living them.